One of the most important things when it comes to your self-improvement journey or overcoming your bad habits or making progress towards certain goals you might have is overcoming this thing known as shame. Oftentimes as dudes, we don't really take time to think about our emotions, and do not stress this video. This is not a video about emotions, or especially not a video about emotions in a blue-haired feminist way, if you know what I'm saying. But there's a graph that I'll pull up on the screen, or a chart that I'll pull up on the screen, and you'll be able to see there's a bunch of emotions listed from the top to the bottom. There'll be a baseline, and anything above that baseline is basically emotions that we like. So there'll be things such as joy, peace, acceptance, and courage, all these great virtuous and comfortable emotions. And then below the line will be these feelings or these states of energy, is another way to categorize it, that we typically don't like, and ones we also might want to avoid, such as things such as pride, ego, anger, and shame. What you'll notice is the emotion at the bottom of this graph. So all these emotions, these feelings are categorized by a number in a number range. And the one between 0 and 20, so at the bottom of this graph, is shame. And that's quite interesting because it's below sadness. Shame is below sadness, which means it is a lower emotion, or it's a deep emotion, or it's a much more painful emotion, and one that we don't like as much compared to sadness. So so to jump off the deep end, just like really quickly, just for a split second, think about like those depressive stages that you've had, or these little ruts that you've had where you've just been depressed for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or even months on a time. That wasn't sadness. That wasn't caused because of sadness. Now, sadness might have contributed to you going down, 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 down. But the thing at the bottom that kept you depressed, shame. It was shame. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this video today, in the next 10, 20, 15 or so minutes. We're basically just going to be talking about one key, simple, not overcomplicated way to conquer shame, so that really you never really fall into these depressive states, or if you do, you're able to come out of them very quickly, and they're very far between each other. Because as men, and even just as human beings, down points, low points, they're unavoidable. Life happens, whatever. But to the best of our ability, we want to focus on what's in our control. And if we can control our mental state and the way that we think, which comes down to everything, if we can control the way that we think to the best of our ability, then we will avoid as many of the unnecessary down points, or these unnecessary ruts, or these low points, or these little unmotivated periods as much as possible, which is the key goal in self-improvement. Because as I said, life happens. You will fail, you will have setbacks, but you want to minimize them as much as we can. And the title of this video, and I guess the moral of this video, is when it comes to defeating shame, humility is the way. And before we go into humility, I'm going to explain to you something very quickly that if you've watched some of my other videos, you might have heard me say this before, but it's this notion of you are not your thoughts. And I have a whole video describing you are not your thoughts. It's literally called You Are Not Your Thoughts. But think about this for a second. There's a difference between shame and guilt. So there's two different emotions, or two different feelings, shame and guilt. So let's say you do something wrong. You fail at something. So let's say you pour over a drink and it spills everywhere. Super simple example. Guilt is basically when you just admit that you've done something wrong, and you just say, I have failed. I poured the milk. The action I took was stupid. That was stupid of me. And then you leave it at there. Guilt is basically just when you acknowledge a failure, or you acknowledge that you could have done better, or that you just did something wrong, which we can all agree is not a bad thing at all. And we can actually agree that it's actually a very good thing to be able to honestly acknowledge when you've failed, when you've done something wrong, because then what does that do? It allows you to find the lesson and make an improvement and then do better next time. So that's what shame is. Shame is just saying, I did this, and you leave it as that. Now, that's what guilt is. My bad. Now, what shame is shame, you don't just stop there. You go one step further. And what you do is you say, I failed, and therefore I am a failure. So you say, I dropped the drink, and that was stupid of me, therefore I am stupid. So another way to say this is you're attaching this sense of failure or whatever you've done to your sense of self, to your identity. So instead of saying I failed, you say I am a failure, or I failed, therefore I am a failure. But think about this. Just because you fail once, or even if you fail 100 times, does that mean you're a failure? No, it just means that you failed 100 times. Because here's the thing, you've also probably won 100 times, or way more of that in the span of your lifetime. It doesn't really matter. It's probably an even playing field of the times that you've won and when you've lost. You get to decide whether you see yourself as a winner or failure. But that's besides the point. This notion of you are not your thoughts applies to not only your thoughts, but also your emotions, your actions, and your outcomes. And if you haven't heard me say this before, there's another great principle, another great thing to just remind yourself of is your thoughts control your emotions. So your thoughts control how you feel. Your thoughts control your emotions, which control your actions, which control your outcomes. So if you think something, you'll feel a certain way, which will make you act a certain way, which will make you achieve a certain outcome. So if you're not getting the outcomes you want in life, it goes back to an action you're taking or not taking, which comes down to how you're feeling or not feeling, which comes down to what you are or you aren't thinking instead. So that's just a really quick thing. But the key thing is in this framework of thoughts, emotions, actions, outcomes, you're neither of them. You just have them. What I like to say is, you are not your thoughts. Just in the same way that you are not your clothes. You have clothes, but you are not your clothes. You have clothes, you own clothes, you wear clothes. Clothes are in your wardrobe and you get to go in there and decide what clothes you want to wear on the day. But you are not your clothes. You just have them. You are not your clothes. Same for your thoughts, emotions, actions, and outcomes. Now, why is it important that I talk about this when it comes to shame, and it's more specifically when it comes to moving forward better in terms of your goals, and more importantly, not falling into these 4, 5, 6 weeks at a time, these ruts that last forever? Well, it all comes down to this thing called shame, because as I said, the difference between guilt and shame is when you take an action, such as a action that leads to failure or that you just didn't perform as well. Guilt is just leaving the action as it is. Guilt is just literally the principle of you are not your actions. I failed. That's it. I just failed. You can look at that honestly. But shame, as I said, is the belief of I am my actions. So I failed, therefore I am a failure. So a key way to mitigate shame, and I'll explain to you how this is actually humility in disguise. It's to separate yourself from your actions. So this is you. This is your actions. You have actions, but you are not your actions. When we do attach our actions to ourself or our sense of self or how we feel about ourselves, it causes us to become what is known as egotistical. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. Now, if I pull up this graph one more time, we know that at the bottom of the graph is shame. And shame is what happens when we're egotistical. So our sense of actions, our actions are tied to our sense of self. Now, when we fail, we feel shame. But what happens when we win? What happens when we succeed? We feel a different emotion. Do you want to know what that emotion is? That's correct. It's the one that all those blue-head feminists celebrate for an entire month. It is pride. And funnily enough, if you look at this graph for 1 second, what is the emotion just below the midpoint? The final dark emotion. It's pride. How cool is that? So the emotion at the top and the bottom of that bottom half are pride and shame. And they're actually two sides of the exact same coin, which is ego. Ego. Because when we talk about you are not your thoughts, basically what we have to realize is no matter what we do, whether it's a good action or a bad action, an action that leads to failure, none of those actions either increase our value or decrease our value compared to anyone else. Now, of course, they might move us further ahead in life in terms of our goals, or in terms of our career, or in terms of our competition between different people. But in terms of our inherent value as a human being, it's meaningless. It means absolutely nothing. Why? Because we are not our actions. Applies to your thoughts as well. You're not your thoughts. The good ones that you have, they don't mean anything. They shouldn't make you feel prideful about yourself, that you are the man. It should just be, I am the man. And I have thoughts, both good ones and bad ones. Both good ones and dark ones. Because as I said, even if you have dark thoughts, it means absolutely nothing. Dark actions, absolutely nothing. Because we've all failed. We've all gone through periods of darkness, means absolutely nothing. When you become prideful, you become what is known as self-righteous. And this is when you go around telling everyone what to do, telling everyone how good you are, but you're not doing it to help them. You say you're doing it to help them, but you're actually doing it to make yourself feel better. This is pride in disguise. This is ego in disguise, and this is also shame in disguise. So you are not your thoughts. Neither your good ones or the ones you're ashamed of. Separate them and you'll no longer feel shame, and you'll also no longer feel pride, because your ego is a sneaky little bitch. It'll creep in obviously in the things you fuck up. That's obvious, but it'll creep in very sneakily in the things you're doing very, very well. Because at the end of the day, we will always be students. Of course, we have a goal. Of course, we want to get to the top of the mountain, and we should always strive to get to the top of the mountain, whilst also realizing that we will never actually reach the top of the mountain. Because even once we reach one top of one mountain, there's always another mountain. There's always things to learn. There's always things to learn. There's always things to improve on. And you'll never get to a point where you are done, where you have acquired all of the wisdom, all of the knowledge that you could possibly ever acquire. Why? Because you will always be a student. And it's very helpful to adopt this mindset of, I am a student. I am always a student. I am going to remain as a student. Because when you remain as a student, when you fail, what happens? It no longer leads to shame. It leads to wisdom. It leads to a learning lesson. Okay, I failed. What can I learn from it? Now, instead of seeing yourself as someone who's failed and now you're a loser, you can now see yourself as someone who's failed and now you're 1 point wiser, or you're a little bit more wiser. Because think about this. You've probably heard the quote from Michael Jordan. If you haven't, you're going to hear it in a minute. But he said he never learned anything from a game that he won. And it's common knowledge that he missed more shots than he took. And he was one of the greatest basketball players to have ever lived. Why? Because he failed a heap. He failed lots. Now we need to not be afraid of failure. And that initially comes from realizing that we are not our actions. Now, when you also adopt this long-term or even this, eternal student mindset, what that also means is even when you're doing well, even when you're winning, even when you have a success, you don't become complacent. You stay as a student, or in other words, you stay humble. You have what's known as humility. You understand that, yes, I'm doing well, but doesn't mean I become complacent. It doesn't mean that I'm number one and there's nothing more for me to learn. Because you can learn at any stage of the game, at the top and at the bottom. And you must. Because when you remain humble, or you develop the skill of humility, which is, as I said, comes from detaching your sense of self from your actions, which keeps you as a student. You remain in this student mindset. It does 3 things, or allows you to do 3 things. The first one, as I said, is when you fail, it allows you to learn the lessons and to become wiser. Because these little pieces of failure, they no longer lead to shame. It stops at guilt. And now you can look at yourself honestly, because it doesn't hurt anymore to look at yourself honestly. Think about that. When you fail, it hurts a little bit to look at yourself honestly. But when you remove your actions from your thoughts, it doesn't hurt as much. It might hurt a little bit, but you move on quicker. You don't stay there. You don't hold on to it. You don't think about it for 2 weeks, moaning and groaning about, how I failed at this. How I failed in my breakup 3 years ago. You're not still thinking about it anymore. Because you're not a failure. You don't see yourself as a failure. You just grab the lesson and move on. That's the first thing it does. The second thing, as I said, is it allows you to avoid the shame. Going back to this graph, if shame is at the bottom of this table, then what is the one emotion that's going to cause you, let's say we're talking about you're trying to overcome porn, for example, or, you're trying to stop drinking. What's the one emotion that's going to keep you drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking every time you go sober, and then after 36 days you quit drinking, or you continue drinking again, you have another drink, or you open up Pornhub again? What's the thing that's going to keep you in that loop of just relapse, or going on a 40-day fapathon after you fap once, or you goon once, on a 70-day no fap streak? Shame. So shame is that one emotion that's keeping you in this loop of relapse and relapse and relapse and relapse. The third and final thing is remaining as a student, which this sounds quite interesting, but when you remain as a student, you actually become a leader who's able to lift up others. Because think about this, when you're no longer a student, when you're stuck in shame and you're stuck in these relapse cycles, you can't lift anyone up. You're not even lifting yourself up. But on the other side of it, if you're a know-it-all, if you're egotistical, yeah, maybe you have some good advice, and you might have some bloody good advice, but no one's going to listen to you. And that advice, when you do give it to them, even though it might be really good advice, it's going to push them down. It's not going to lift them up. Even if you intend for it to lift them up, it's not going to come across that way. So humility is the way, and humility will allow you to learn your lessons from failure, and therefore to not feel shame. And then in the process, with these learning lessons, you'll be able to pass them on to other people that lifts them up. And now you're just a natural born leader. And I'll share with you my experiences with this, with just one of my addictions that I overcome. I'll use vaping as an example, or nicotine, because I used to vape, but I'd smoke every now and then. And I've been helping young men overcome their bad habits for the past 3 or 4 years now, around the start of last year. So right now, at the time of calling this, it's November 2025. So let's say January 2024. That's when I stopped vaping for good. And for about a year before that, so let's say all of 2023, towards the start of 2024, as well in January, but all of 2023, I was heavily vaping. And I was also a coach trying to help people to improve their life, get on self-improvement, and to stop their bad habits. And here's the thing, because I was a coach who was also vaping, and that was the only bad habit I really had at the time, was vaping, because I'd conquered all the others. But this one I couldn't seem to crack. There was a huge misalignment. I was a coach helping people to stop vaping, but I was also vaping every now and then. I'd go 2 months without it, but then I'd go on like a 2-month really heavy into the vapes. And I hit it. No one knew. No one knew that I vaped, except for maybe just a handful of friends who, when I went out clubbing, because I used to go clubbing a lot back in the day because I used to be a DJ, they'd see it, but no one else would. None of my clients knew. Even my partner at the time, she didn't know. I don't think she ever saw me vape once. Unless maybe when we were out, maybe at the start of our relationship, but not towards the end. And I remember I'd drive to her house and it'd just be in the center console. Rocked up to her house, and before I got out of the car, have a big puff. It'll be like my final puff for the next 3, 4, 6 hours, whatever. Hide it in the console, hide it in the glove box in case we end up going for a drive. And then, when it was time for me to go home, hop in the car, leave the driveway, have a nice big puff. I hit it. Even on some of my coaching calls, And when no one was looking at me, I used to duck out to the side, pretend I was just looking at the ground or something, have a puff. And this was because of shame. Because shame was stopping me from looking at myself honestly and saying, hey, this needs to stop. I knew deep down that it needed to stop, but not only was I hiding it from everyone else, but, because I was hiding it from everyone else, that also meant that I was hiding it from myself. I was hiding it from myself. And at the moment, there might be something you're hiding from yourself. And that's okay. That's okay. And you know what it is, because it probably just popped up into the back of your mind. It's alright. You're not your actions. You're not going to die if someone finds out, or even if you find out that you're failing a little bit. It's okay. Look at yourself honestly, because you are not your actions. Grab the lesson. Even ask for help. One of my favorite quotes is, asking for help isn't giving up, it's refusing to give up. Now, fortunately, I didn't need help. As soon as I got found out, I was actually vaping in my room one day and one of my parents walked in, and that was the end for me. I said, okay, I've been found out now. That's it. Didn't touch it since. It was actually very easy. As soon as I just looked at myself honestly, or basically I was forced to because I was found out, that was it. It's the easiest for me. Didn't have to think about it ever again. Why? Because I had no choice. I now had to look at myself and say, yep, I'm doing this. I'm not my actions. Done. Let's stop. That's it now. Vaping for me, because I've been found out, it was no longer shameful. I no longer had to hide it because I couldn't, because now everyone knew. So at the moment, you might be hiding something from yourself. You might be hiding something from others, or you might just be in this loop. It might not even be that deep, but you're just in this loop of constantly, you have 2 months of really good progress and then you just fall off for 2 months, even if that's with the gym or getting some work done, whatever it is. The thing that's holding you back is shame. And the cure to shame is humility. And the easiest way to develop humility is you are not your actions. This is you. This is your actions. They're not here. They're separate. Just like your thoughts. Just like your clothes. You're not your clothes. You just have clothes. You're not your actions. You just have your actions. Both the good and the bad are meaningless. They're important. They can either move you further towards your goal or further away, but you're not your goals either. You're not your outcomes. So relax. It's going to be okay, bro. Now, that's all from me today. As I said, asking for help isn't giving up. It's refusing to give up. So if you would like to work with me, you can hop down into the description. There's a bunch of things down there, both free and paid for. I also have a free Discord community with a bunch of the dudes who I work with personally one-on-one, and also with a bunch of the dudes who hop in via my content, such as my YouTube here and my Instagram and my TikTok. So just go down there into the description. There'll be a bunch of free resources you can check out, free guides and stuff like that. And there'll be also some paid things if you want to work more closely with me or you want to fast track your way towards your goals. So thank you very much for listening today, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care.